Welcome to TradeTheNBI.com. This is John. This report is for the 13th of April. Hopefully everyone had a wonderful Easter Passover holiday. The market was off from Friday. Having achieved the 50% mark, spiked up just above that, take out the highs there to try and capture any new shorts that were, right at that level, and then proceeded to kind of fade a little bit. We're at a critical spot here when you look at DOC readings as well as shakeout, because you've just turned positive with the histogram. It's starting to arc a little bit. We've been in rising gold within this latest move above the 23. So this is quite a move given what usually happens with gold. Around the 23% rising, they rarely fare very well. This has actually been quite a good run given that, but a rollover here is going to be significant because that would create an expectation to move back towards this 23% line and potentially even lower than that. So that's what I'd be looking for. Of course, we're in the weakest part of this setup here with steel falling. Not really much activation from a short standpoint. We're not really seeing any activity from cyan in the form of it popping up. Orange, if it can dip down, that would be the possibility of saving, the return here and possibly seeing us move back up. Whoops, that was an accident. Go back up to where that was. And that's where some of these other algo levels are going to come into play, particularly when you have such a range between the 50%, the 38%, and the 23. I mean, these are significant ranges. So from a daily standpoint, that can give you some range to play with. And I don't see much impetus for really panicking about any of these moves. You're going to still continue to see volatility. That's kind of given in the expectation of it. The question is not letting something run against you if you're starting with short-term trades and being able to progress from there, because seeing 100 so point moves in the S&P from an ES standpoint is pretty significant, and you don't want to let that volatility take you in the wrong direction when it's not necessary, because we can pretty well see from our smaller time frames, 5K, 50K charts, the overall direction of how things are starting to turn. From an NQ standpoint, likewise situation. So while it's been slightly better than the S&P, mimicking now, so starting to get a little bit more cohesion between the readings, and of course central banks still operating at the same range here for the euro, maintaining it. So it's as though there's been no change at all, and you've got to appreciate the beauty of that despite all of this, everything is exactly as it was before all of this took place, and yet none of the world is working. It's an interesting paradox here that's been created, and how long can they keep it up? This is what we don't know. From an oil standpoint, of course, there was supposed to be a deal, didn't work out with the Russians and the Saudis and everything. It's going to mean just more turmoil, and if oil continues to suffer, it's deflationary in a hyperinflationary period of massive money printing. It is an interesting aspect because it is the one few items that can actually prevent hyperinflation from taking hold in the near term with this much money printing. And of course, it's also an interesting one because the Treasury is printing the money, the Fed is then issuing the debt, but it's not really owed to anyone but the Fed, which is basically some private banks, but at the end of the day, it's being now administered by the Treasury under this emergency order. So it's so convoluted, it's meant to make it impossible for people to understand, and that's the beauty of it. So we would expect gold's going to break out into new highs coming up here, because the fear of this whole explosion in just, because now that you've written a couple of trillion, you're going to do a couple of trillion more, there's just no fear in writing these big giant checks, and that terrifies people. Well, this is interesting. I had created in the Opus 2 program, and I'll be sending that update down, so you'll have that for the start. What I did was I went ahead and marked the pivots of the blue or the azure line up above, and I created these little dotted lines to come up. It just makes it easier for me to visualize when I'm seeing it. I'll actually leave them in as an input. If you want to turn them on, you could. But it shows up pivots being in the green for the Azure line. I haven't quite gotten to the crossover points. I was also doing functions for each of the different lines for those that want to actually use them in conjunction with the other indicators. I know you see my MBI indicator on there, but the reason for that was the incorporation of it into, with the DOC, into the Power Mode 2. So pretty straightforward in how we read this, because you'll see the power of when we dip below those 13 lines, but also at the high pivots, particularly the yellow ones, were also good indications where if you had falling Azure at those particular points, they were usually peak moves, so there's not going to be as many yellow configurations. There's too many of the gentle red ones, simply because any pivot up above 13 is still in that bullish trend. So it's one of those where what I was looking for is to create the conditions then beyond just a crossover, because by the time you wait for a crossover in some cases, you've had a pretty substantial move. Like in this particular case, it was that pivot and break below the 13 back up here at 27.93 on the 5K that really signaled the end of the pump pre-market before it collapsed. 70, 80 points was a significant move going down there. That being said, it is worth paying attention, because when you see these red pivots coming back up, that is actually relatively an indication of a bearish expression, and it works out fairly decent. Doesn't mean they're going to continue. It's just a short representation within that, and you can see that when they've come in, we get brief bars down. That's if you were scalping, that it becomes more relevant. My goal with it is that used in conjunction with your DOC, it becomes both the early warning of situations and also confirmation, and that's the beauty of it, because it's coming and derived from completely separate indicator techniques and modeling. So when you have that kind of dual referencing, it becomes much more powerful, and that's literally what you want. Is you want to add to your confidence in particular situations, especially at the bottoms. And this is where going through and identifying all of our key buy areas and then setting aside conditions within those has been the practice that I've been working with over the long weekend. Did quite a good amount of work with it. So it's all exciting items, but if you wanted to create alerts for crossovers and that with the functions, you can create any simple kind of preference that you have, and you just put the alert language to it, and instantly you'd have any type of setup alert that you're looking for. From intraday action, we can slide through here. There was quite a bit of back and forth. We had some nice moves up and came down. Of course, you can see that within some of these little down setups, a lot of DOC spreads that came in very clean. And this one was supposed to be a little bit more dramatic, as it signaled before. But oftentimes with it, you got to understand these what I call sigma moves, they'll happen early, and you oftentimes will get a dual signaling. So in this particular case, you had one bearish and one bullish configuration. So as we had the bearish, but with the DOC still complete reset and no dip below the red line, that was quite a bit more bullish than not. And sure enough, once the green crossed over cyan right there, took off. But when it reached its peak, and you have the crossover, so this one matched the BK signal right on the money. So that's pretty exciting when that happens, even though the DOC spread came in right there at the peaks, and it was on just a move that was accelerating going into the power mo. So waiting just a fraction, not a problem, but it certainly will help because you don't want to be oftentimes getting into these moves that are just going straight up, because just because something's at a high doesn't mean it's not going to make a new one. And that actually fulfilled the Sigma move going further down. And this is where it becomes interesting too, because within the conditions of this orange candle, this also was signaled from an MBI standpoint, because we can see the cyan numbers in that, which I had created in right there, but no DOC steel reset within that. So within those conditions, it would set a proof factor where as soon as you had a cyan split and then green move back below, you would be exiting the long setup for move back lower. And sure enough, as the pivot right here, right now I only have the pivots marked for when they're above, I believe it's 13. I'll probably lower it just a little bit for ones also that are slightly underneath it, because it's the same short effect right here. You're going along smooth, and then you just dip down, boom, right there for 1026 from that reading on the directional, and then it cascaded lower, and so that was pretty clean. And since you don't have steel coming from underneath, much harder for it to rebound. I mean, this is where those crosses of cyan become so important, because the steel crosses above, that's bullish from that standpoint, and then boom, turns bearish when it crosses back below, because you don't have the steel reset. And that, while it may not have been much, it still was, but what you saw was the pivot up of the blue azure, which helped express this takeover. So you had the brief move lower, and that lasted, right? And then boom, it crossed right back above for the next leg. So now this could have continued lower without that dip back below, and then we would have just seen, a deeper cascade. But in this particular case, it didn't. It did, however, mark the dip below the red line right there. And you can see that that ends up getting satisfied here in the pre-market at the end of the day. So it works out. You just sometimes have to be, it's going to be a little tougher with the Power Mode 2, because it is ahead of where action is. It's letting you see that actual build take place. And so my hope is to minimize these Sigma events by, like I said, put in the inputs, the number 1, so that it reduces the range to the 45. Otherwise, you'll have these big giant moves that will shrink the view. But what it does is it will print the number below the zero line of what the actual reading was, so that if you want to know how significant it was, you'll be able to have that information. So that's the long and the short of it. I will continue to plug away with those items and get them sent out to you so that you'll have it. And we'll go over more of this in days to come. And it should be exciting to preview it all, along with the adaptations that will take place within the PNT2. Because what will end up happening with those simply is, instead of seeing this blue candle where the actual signal for buy or sell will be further down the line, and you won't even see the blue candle anymore. It'll just end up being red, and then it'll flip to it when all of the conditions are met. So it'll make it cleaner that way, but at least it lets us know that we have a key inflection point that we have to make further assessments on. And so that's what's beautiful about that. As always, though, trade well. We'll talk again later.